Peter Saville, welcome to SHOWstudio.
Thank you, Lou. Nice to be here again.
I'm glad. Big question to start with. When I was researching you for this interview and talking to different people, reading different conversations you've done in the past, you're referred to in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's as a graphic designer, sometimes it's kind of, an art director or a creative director, sometimes it's just simply as an artist. I'm interested, what do you think you do?
I don't know. Lou, that's just straight away a bit of I find a bit of a torment. Perhaps I shouldn't. In some ways, it's probably fabulous to not be fixed somewhere, to not be contained, in some kind of box. And that I have been involved in very different types of activities, and that I continue to be at present is probably really it's probably very interesting. And it is interesting, and it does kind of appeal to me, and it enthuses me, and it does I kind of feel kind of honoured by it. If I just think of 2 or 3 things that I have on at the moment, it is a great honour to be doing any one of them, and to be involved in all of them is kind of unusual. The downside of it is that, as we live in an era of increasing specialization, with so many people around doing things, and everybody being very specific, and everybody having a very kind of focused brand about who they are and where they do it and how they do it. And in a way, the kind of the leveraging of remuneration for being absolutely the person to photograph bananas. Then I'm handicapped professionally. I'm handicapped financially by not being definitively one kind of person, or one type of person or another. In the broader, bigger sphere of communications, which is where I'm kind of professionally most positioned. The work at the highest level is about something that I don't want to do. I mean, I almost kind of appropriated the sphere of communications for my own ends, to actually express things that I wish to express, and was very fortunate in the early years to get that opportunity. But of course, at the higher level, at the highly remunerated level of communications for banks, insurance companies, governments, airlines, etc., luxury corporations, it's not actually about what you think, it's about what message the business requires to give to its audience. So the obvious cliched payoff place for me to end up as a communications consultant, art director at this time in my life, that obvious payoff place is not somewhere that I'm interested to go.
Yeah.
The platform of free speech that we, in a way, most associate, let's say, with art now, is a place I can go, but where I'm not exactly recognized as an artist. Why? I'm allowed there. They let me go there. I'm welcome there, and I'm respected there. But my brand is not artist. So it's fabulously interesting to be multifaceted, but in a climate of infinitesimally specific brands, it's not the easiest or the most rewarding place to be.
I can imagine. A lot of what you just said there kind of ties to something I wanted to ask later, but it's pertinent, which is about record sleeves, which I'm sure you're very tired of talking about. But I was thinking a lot when I was researching about that idea of communication and about sort of the very nature of graphic design tends to be that you have to have something to communicate.
Yes.
Whereas actually a record sleeve, you don't necessarily.
Somebody does.
Somebody does, but in a sense, you know, when someone goes to buy a record, they already know they want it. They perhaps already know the
absolutely.
band.
They don't need to be told to buy it at all.
Exactly.
No,
so it's this kind of weird space that exists somewhere between art and somewhere between, like you can't make a poster about nothing, which
exactly.
you can make a record sleeve about
exactly.
nothing.
Even Emily King, who was actually the editor of the first book, the first Peter Saville monograph, I expressed to Emily one day the notion of being an independent communications designer.
Yeah.
And she said, "How do you mean?" And I said, "Well, you know, if you take, let's say, even a furniture designer or a potter, they can be independent. You know, they can make a chair or a pot, or a fashion designer can make a garment that they want to make. Whether any patron or client or company asks for it, they can do it. You know, the very essence of, let's say, couture collection is someone expressing themselves to a non-specific brief. But exactly as you say with communication." The graphic designer's role in the sphere of communications is to deliver a given message, and it's not their message, it's someone else's message. If it's their own message, then they're no longer actually being a graphic designer, communications designer, they're being an author or an image maker or a political activist. They're actually expressing their own opinion. And conventionally, the sphere of communications design is not about expressing your own opinion. It is helping else deliver their message. That's why you get paid money for it. The phenomenon of the record cover is it's neatly encapsulated, painfully but neatly encapsulated by something that Tony Wilson would always maintain, that pop was the art of the playground. Now, it used to upset at the age of between the age of 25 and 30, when Tony would remind me that pop was the art of the playground, it kind of upset me because I was trying to get away from the playground as a young adult, and it seemed to intellectually, in a way, devalue the culture of pop, to think of it, to frame it in that way. Some years later now, I can look much more sort of favourably on that point of view, in that by being the art of the playground, in this post-war period of whatever that is now, 60, 70 years, pop has been the generic given culture to all young people in the Western world, given and shared universally by them. So ever since my teens in, remember that, the 60s, I have been sharing in a common culture of pop with all the other people of my own age, and then with younger people. And that, of course, that has become just increasingly prevalent over, you know, the 50 years from the 60s until now. So there's this common grounding, a kind of foundation course in shared popular culture that we all have to some degree or another, and particularly in the UK. Because the UK is this tiny test case, kind of project space of pop. Pop culture is intense in this country. We have a very large number of people in a relatively very small space, all on the same time zone for most of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, sharing like one or two TV channels and one or two radio channels, a really shared experience. And also in the first language of pop, which is English. The disadvantage to all non-English speaking young people, the disadvantage of the last 50, 60 years, has been the slight obfuscation, the difficulty to understand at core what pop is about if you don't fully get the language. You know, if you think that Talking Heads are a dance band, you're missing something about what's going on with Talking Heads. And you know, there are plenty of people, there's plenty of French people who think that. And you know, one has to be understanding and have some sympathy about that. So English is the first language of pop. It is the language of pop predominantly. And in the UK, we have like a place the size of a very small American state with 55 million people in it. So we have this crucible of pop culture. You know, if something is happening in a playground in Manchester today, then Glasgow and London know about it by the end of the day. Even when I was growing up about it, they knew it with it in days. Now, I mean, now it's instantaneous. Yeah. So therefore you have this shared experience, and that, it's actually that has had bearing on what happened to me, in that my work reached through a kind of, through the sort of marginal channels of pop culture, it reached a very wide range of people unexpectedly, who were still all in their formative teens. And then they went on to become doctors, accountants, bus drivers, artists, photographers, fashion designers, architects, entrepreneurs, business people, homeless people, I mean, across the board, teachers, educators. I made a certain impression, or the work that I was able to do through the autonomy of factory allowed me to make this impression upon people, which has had some bearing on their own standards, values, and how they see the world. So the consequence of that is actually this strange multilateral place where I operate now, where I'm, you know, still the consultant creative director of a city, of Manchester, which is a kind of governmental kind of position to be in. I'm doing that. I had some work in the Venice Biennale last week. I have a commission from the Tate to create some imagery about the evolution of Tate Modern. I have some fashion clients. I have a textile company in Denmark who I'm consultant to. I've just done a record cover. I'm involved in this cross section of things that shouldn't really happen. But when I turn up at a meeting now, quite often the marketing director or the CEO is a Joy Division fan. And this is quite odd, you know, they're younger than me. Yeah. And in many cases they're a fan of some sort, of something that I was involved in 25, 30 years ago. And it's because of the art of the playground. It's because my work made some connection with people before they decided who they were or what their career was going to be, before they even knew what they were interested in. We all have this mutual engagement with pop.
Do you think it made that impact because when you were creating it, not to put you down, but you were kind of in a similar place where you were working out what you were about and you were kind of in that kind of culture?
Yeah, and to some extent. I mean,
because you said before that those works, they're kind of about nothing, so because of that they're kind of about you.
They are definitely about me. The special thing for me to remind myself always is that specifically Factory Records gave everybody involved an opportunity of autonomy. Okay, because Factory formed as a kind of cooperative venture that was not founded in any kind of financial model. In this kind of immediate post-punk moment of the late 70s. Everybody involved got to do the thing that they wanted to do the way they imagined you could do it. So it's kind of, in a way, adolescent entrepreneurship, adolescent artistic expression. So the boys who were in groups could be in a group the way a young person thinks being in a group is. There was no contract, there was no advance, there was no business, there was no money, no one gave them any money. So therefore there was no obligation to do anything. So they just were in a group the way a teenager thinks you're in a group. You rehearse a bit and hang around a bit and write a few things and then maybe get a gig and play a bit and people throw things at you and that's it. But the price of that is that they had to keep their day jobs. Nobody gave them £1 million and said, okay, you now reinvent yourself, but you're on top of the box next Tuesday. I mean, there was freedom. And the price of that freedom was no advance, no promotion, no advertising. And people who managed groups were able to manage, Rob Gretton managed Joy Division in an entirely ideological way. Because there was no debt. He had not just been given £500,000, which he had to make good within 12 months. There was no debt, so therefore there was no responsibility. And the same applied to me. I was able to utilize the medium of graphics freely, without any obligation to anyone, other than the groups. Now, normally in the practice of doing record covers, there is an obligation to the group. So, I've never, ever, ever had a brief from a record company. I've occasionally had a brief from a manager that was insightful. A fabulous woman called Gail Coulson took me to one side after Peter Gabriel had created the album So. And she said, Peter, you have to bring him out for this. And she said, when you hear it, you'll know why I said that. And when I heard So, I knew exactly what Gail meant. Peter had, without a doubt, created a great body of work, a great body of songs, from Sledgehammer to Don't Give Up, that transcended any core audience that Peter Gabriel had at that time. Yeah. Those songs were for everybody. And I realized what Gail meant, that there had to be a face, there had to be a personality for this wider range of people to be able to relate to. And that was probably about as close to a brief as I've ever had for a record cover. But obviously individual musicians and the kind of archetypal head of a group, and there's always a kind of there's always a sort of a political structure in a group. There's a hierarchy, and whenever you meet a group, you kind of know before you meet them who is the hierarchical head.
Yeah.
The art director, sleeve designer, whatever, is working for that person. It's their album, and so it's their cover. And your job is to help facilitate that. So in many cases, that's what I've done.
But did you really feel that when you were working on the... Yeah.
In the case of the kind of post-punk moment of Factory, initially with Joy Division, everything was in a proto-state. There was no hierarchy that had formed within Joy Division. And always with groups in their early months, there's no hierarchy. Having a van can make you much more important than being able to play an instrument. So there was a kind of definitely a kind of egalitarian mood within Joy Division in 1978, 79. Nobody presumed to be dominant over the others. There was a feeling of extreme detachment and cool So they had an image that they had found that they would like to have on their first album cover, and that was the pulsar graph from the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Astronomy, the unknown pleasures image, which was, you know, unquestionably a great enigmatic image for an album cover. They'd found that most groups know what they want on their first album cover or their first single because they've been thinking about it for years, or, you know, for months or years, and they know the title, they know everything. It's after that that they don't really have time. So Joy Division had the waveform, but all other questions were kind of moot. So would anyone like to put the title with the image? No, it's a bit obvious, isn't it? Yeah, we all agree that's a bit obvious. Would anyone like to put the name of the group on the cover or on the front? No, it's not very cool, is it? No, it's not very cool. Would anyone like to write any credits, really, or say what they did? That's not very cool either, is it? So when we did Unknown Places, there was this almost a straitjacket of cool.
Yeah.
It's a total reticence. So I came away, and that was the brief. So I came away with the wavy diagram of CP 1919, the first pulsar I've ever recorded. And really, the complete freedom or no obligation to do anything else. To put a title, to put the name of the group, anything. And I couldn't quite figure out how to do it. So I could have put the title on, I could have put Joy Division on the front. But in the same way that it was their first album, it was my first album cover. And I couldn't figure out how to do it because I didn't know very much either. And it was good that it was in black and white because I didn't know how to do anything in colour. I couldn't have done colour artwork at that time. I had no idea how to do colour artwork. I had no idea how to specify it for print. So I put the whole thing together on a glorified version of a photocopy machine, a studio camera, a graphic studio camera, the so-called PMT machine. And I did the maximum nothing that I could do. And they didn't want any information, so I didn't really put any information. And it worked. It created this strangely enigmatic object, and exactly as you said at the beginning, when people want a record, they want a record. It really, the famous brown paper bag, it really doesn't matter. Occasionally, you will buy a record that you didn't know you wanted because of the cover.
Yeah, do you think that was kind of the case with Blue Monday?
Occasionally, people will buy a record.
Yeah.
And that has, in you know, since the late 80s and 90s, that has become a thing. People say to me sometimes, I bought the record.
Was that not the case with Blue Monday?
No. But you've never, the key point is, you've never not bought a record you wanted because of the cover. So sometimes, you know, there's something that we want, and we're elated to say, wow, it looks great as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're disappointed and think, oh, crikey, that's... I don't really, but it doesn't stop you buying it. So therefore the record cover has no function other than to protect the record. It has no function. So in that sense, it is packaging, not unlike an art medium. It actually has no specific function. And if you have no requirement of conveying information either, then you have a relatively free-form pseudo art object. For young people.
Is that why do you think people adore your covers so much? Because going back to what you yourself said about your practice and the way you like to operate, it seems like you like operating in that way the most. So not that it's your best work, but
because I perhaps should have been a fashion designer. I perhaps should have had, or an artist, I perhaps should have been in a discipline that afforded me my own initiative.
Yeah, because there's an amazing quote which you gave in a past interview, which which I love, where you said, I'm really not that interested in doing graphic design. It's the context and the meaning of the work that appeals to me. And the person interviewing you said, where has this led you to? And you said, unemployable.
Yes, well, but yeah, I mean, people do refer to me as unemployable. If somebody comes to you, or you kind of go to them, if there is a cause, and that might be, a humanitarian issue, it might be a handbag. If there is a cause, if there's a thing, a product, a service, a commodity, an experience, if there's something that you appreciate, value, and like, and have some enthusiasm for, then being involved with that in some way is always kind of compelling to us. We are kind of magnetically drawn to things that we think are kind of cool or good. So whether it's, Chanel or Médecins Sans Frontières, they're great things, And yes, I would pick up the phone if Chanel called, and yes, I would pick up the phone if Médecins Sans Frontières called.
But it doesn't seem
because they're extraordinary. Now, so if as a communicator, somebody who knows a little bit about how to frame a message or frame an entity, if you're asked to help with that, to help something that you kind of feel something for, then that's brilliant. But the formal career of the communications designer is to deliver the messages that you are asked to deliver. Now, this is what kills most young people who go into communications design. They go to work in a studio, and it's a job, and they have to do the job. So they find themselves, being asked to do sandwich wrappers for boots. They ask themselves being found to find a way to put some extra info on a Sky Broadband, web page or something. And it's just, they find themselves just ground down by the awful banality of 99% of communications work. I mean, our entire globe is a communications sphere, and most of it is either awful in its intent or just aesthetically awful. I mean, there's a few things that look beautiful, but actually when we say, what is this for? We go, oh no, not that. And there's a lot of stuff which just still looks terrible. And I mean, this pained me enormously as a young person. I would look out at the world we were in, and I knew how things could be done, and I saw how they were done. And this actually I found really, really painful and really upsetting. By the time I was at art college, I knew that I probably didn't want to go to the real world of the job. But I wanted to be involved somehow in visual culture and in a way in art. But art didn't exist in my world, in the kind of an actual world that I knew. It didn't exist at all. And certainly not contemporary art. Growing up in an industrial, about to become post-industrial city in the north of England in the 60s and early 70s, contemporary art was something that definitely was going on somewhere in the world, perhaps in New York, and kind of appeared occasionally in my life in a book or the Sunday magazines, which had just kind of started then in the 60s. But there was no art reality in the world that I knew. So the idea of going to art college to do art was, to me, in a kind of middle class business family value way, to me was unimaginable.
I want to just nab that idea that you just said about art as reality, because it's something we talked about before we went live, which I think is something you've kind of between, as you say, being a graphic designer or being an artist or wherever you are on that strange kind of career spectrum. It seems like something that does engage you is the notion of putting art into people's lives, regardless of whether they're a collector. Tell me more about that.
Well, that's kind of what happened. That's what that's what the autonomy of factory gave me the opportunity to do.
But did you only do that at factory?
I did it certainly I did it initially and most purely at factory. In that once I was at art college, I discovered a thing which I would now refer to as the canon. Okay, so I went in on a kind of ticket of design, of kind of graphics. I liked fashion a lot. I was enormously interested in fashion. I was more interested in fashion than anything else as a teenager.
When you say fashion, what do you mean? What kind of?
Well, initially, image and identity.
Okay.
And that does quite quickly lead you, seeking out image and identity does quickly lead you to the kind of the first entry levels of fashion. So, there are some very critical things that happen in the 70s, in my opinion. The blueprint of the now is without a doubt in the 70s. The first concert that I went to was in 1969, and I was 14, and I went to a Blind Faith concert in Manchester. And Blind Faith were one of the first supergroups, the first group formed by people who had kind of in a way made a name for themselves in other groups. But I didn't go to see Blind Faith. I went to see the person who was supporting Blind Faith. And he was a guy who had a single in the charts called Space Odyssey. So I went to see David Bowie supporting Blind Faith. So I went to see David Bowie. As a 14-year-old, I went to see David Bowie. Now, David Bowie is, without a doubt, the first really significant formative influence upon me and many people of my generation. David Bowie suggested, and certainly, post Space Oddity and when he kind of comes back as Ziggy.
Creating an image.
Yeah, by which time I am, let's say 72, I am 17. David Bowie puts to these younger teenagers the notion that you might be able to be something yourself, that you might actually be able to create an identity for yourself. Now, this was a very relatively a very new idea for ordinary young people in ordinary parts of Britain. It was perhaps not exciting or not revelatory at all to privileged children from artistic families or wealth families or whatever, but to ordinary kids in ordinary homes at ordinary schools, the idea that you might actually create an identity for yourself that isn't given, that I'm not the world's most virtuoso rock player, so therefore I will be a rock god. I am not a great filmmaker, so that actually you could just invent something for yourself, that you could actually go to the vintage clothes shop or to the makeup or to the makeup table in your mum's bedroom or whatever, and actually invent an image. And this was like a major lesson from kind of Professor Bowie, and that actually not only might you need to invent one image, you might need, in the faster and faster times of pop, have to invent an evolving or different image, that you might have an image for a while and then you might come back or reinvent yourself with another image. So this is critical.
But I don't understand, because it seems to me today, I get why that appealed to you as kind of 16, 17-year-old you.
Yeah.
But today it seems to me, just from conversations we've had in the past, I don't want to use something you said off camera against you, but things about authenticity are very important to you. I get that impression. So do you think that creating an identity kind of just through aesthetics, which is kind of what you're saying there, can ever be authentic?
Okay, so it's okay. So this kind of relates to something we mentioned earlier before we started the film. I was saying something earlier today about psychological fit. What's really difficult to imagine now in 2015, what's really difficult to imagine is a period or a socio-cultural moment 50 years ago where the notion of self-realization was foreign to most people. The idea that you might have somebody in you other than who your parents were is a quite modern contemporary idea. When I was growing up, people still did, for the most part, what was expected of them. And, they had a bit of a kind of, rebellious time in their teens, and then they got their hair cut, bought a suit, married a man, whatever, and basically repeated in some way the life that their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents had had before. Maybe just moving along a little bit to a bigger house, a better job, or something, a motor car. It was all very on rails. Life was on rails. I mean, one of the problems that we have, the kind of socio-political crisis at the moment, is that life is no longer on rails for anybody. And there are great sections of the community who don't know what to do with themselves when life is not on rails. Yeah. And the state has not prepared them for the new, uncertain world that they find themselves in. So the idea that you might be somebody other than who your parents were was actually still a kind of breaking kind of idea in ordinary homes, 40 and 50 years ago. That there might be something to invent, that you might be gay. I mean, nobody wanted to countenance that. That you might want to go and live in a foreign country. This was a strange thing to do. My mother wasn't happy when I just went as far as London. So the notion of finding who we are and doing things that were really different to how we grew up, that is something we totally take for granted now. I mean, we're sitting in the most exclusive part of the West End of London, and there's half a dozen people here, and I bet nobody here was born around the corner. I bet none of you were born in Belgravia. And I would imagine that, some have come a little journey to here, and others in the room have come a very, very long way. In fact, as I drove myself here and went down the Mall today with the Union Jacks and the sun was shining, I kind of thought, I actually thought, this is very nice. Here I am in London on a lovely sunny day in May. May was my mother's birthday. Her birthday made me think of my parents, and I kind of thought, actually, you've come reasonably a long way. Don't. I mean, there are things troubling me in life at the moment, but then I just sort of reflected, you've come quite a long way. It's not that bad. We are able to come a very, very long way now, compared to previous decades. So this notion, and this was the inspiration, the motivation for this, has been delivered in this country by pop, without a doubt. It was not school, it was not family, it was not state that said to me, actually, the horizons are where you want them to be. They didn't say that to me at all. It was actually David Bowie who said to me, you could go anywhere. And that was a really, and I think that there are thousands of other people of my generation who actually consciously or subconsciously picked up that same message. The next educators for me were Roxy Music, who proposed that there was already by the early 70s a canon of pop, of popular music, and that in what was to become called a postmodern way, you could collage that canon. So you didn't actually have to be just the new, you didn't have to be just the progressive that has not been done before. The progressive might be an unexpected collage of what has been done before, but in a way recontextualized. So this notion of looking back eclectically in order to go forward, that was delivered to me courtesy of Roxy Music.
But you have a bit of a problem with this today, though, don't you? Because we've talked before where you've said that, you know, you were drawing on things when you put together, like, let's say Blue Monday, for example, but you said, you know, Marinetti would have liked Blue Monday, but you say the way people collage or reference or quote your work, you don't necessarily like it. You feel like it's been devalued. So do you think we've kind of...
It's really a matter of context. I mean...
Because it seems like there's two things with that. There's the positivity of taking lots of different ideas and reinventing things, but then also there's the difficulty of the kind of scrapbook mentality of
okay, all right, one bit at a time.
Sorry.
The positive bits first.
I've never seen someone think in such a physical way, Peter.
You've never seen someone think in a difficult way?
I've never seen someone think in such a physical way.
Oh, physical way, okay, sorry. Well, there's a big multiplicity of things that it is kind of almost physical to try and, you know, kind of cluster together, hold on to. In order to not lose track of things, that early work that I did was based on the freedom that I had to disseminate things that I saw. So I went to the art college library, discovered the canon of design. I went looking for design and found art. So I found all of the roots of 20th century design thinking in the artistic upheavals at the turn of the 20th century. So it was all there. So you know, you go looking for range left Helvetica, you find Malevich's Black Square. That happens quite quickly. I remember the day in the first term of the third year where I came back from the college library one day with a stack of books in front of me and felt like an ignorant person. It was the day my further education started, when I realized what I didn't know. And also when I realized the bigger context in which the work I thought I was interested in fitted. So, you know, you go and study graphics because you like Fiorucci stickers, or you like record covers, you know, and you find Russian Constructor, you find Malevich's Black Square, and you go, oh, it's that moment where you realize that you didn't know just how much you don't know. So I had that moment one day at art college, and from that moment on, I became, you know, kind of just voracious about finding things out and discovering things and learning, looking and learning. And as I looked and learned, I came across things which I found analogous to the moment. So, you know, my tempo, as I mentioned, had been fashion. Okay, so the David Bowie route and on led me to fashion. The pulse beat that I was following in the 70s was fashion. It was not design. I did not see things, I was not close enough to any leading edges of avant-garde design to be able to follow that. I was not close enough to art to follow that. The place where I sensed the pulse beat was fashion. And it was fashion that to me was manifesting the zeitgeist of the time. So words like zeitgeist I discovered, you know, when I was at art college. I was a big fan of the word zeitgeist.
Such a cliche.
Yeah, indeed. And that was the sort of the click track, the metronome that I was following. I was looking at what was going on in fashion and finding analogies to that, more obviously more often than not abstractly, within painting, sculpture, typography, early film, early photography, and when there was a kind of a moment of kind of convergence, when I had to do something where I felt that there was a sort of a certain synergy with something from the canon of culture, I had this complete freedom to do it. So in 1983, when I saw an oil painting of a bunch of roses by Fantin Latour, I'd gone to the National Gallery looking for something completely different and picked up a postcard of roses. I was looking for a solution to something called Power, Corruption and Lies by New Order. And that there was an unexpected enigmatic synergy there. And I had complete freedom to put Fantin Latour's roses on the cover of Power, Corruption and Lies. And I felt in that moment that there was a pertinence to a certain romanticism that had been denigrated by the term chintz. There was a certain pertinence and romanticism that could be in the now. Now, there was a fashion parallel. Georgina Godley and Scott Crowler had a shop called Crowler on Dover Street, and Georgina was running up dresses from Sanderson's upholstery fabrics. So Georgina was already going out, finding chintz fabrics that should really have been in Country Life magazine and making summer frocks out of them. So we were picking up on a kind of neo-60s Haight-Ashbury flower power thing, but ironically using chintzy pseudo-romanticism as the kind of visual analogy. Partly because it was ironically cool to put a 19th century oil painting of roses on a New Order album called Power, Corruption and Lies was, of course, you know, frightfully ironic. But also buried within that was the fact that I liked the painting.
But you say you didn't know it when you went there and you saw it, you kind of came across it haphazardly.
Yeah.
How is that different, which I know pisses you off because you talked about it in interviews before, how is that different to a kid finding a Joy Division cover on Tumblr, posting it without knowing what it is?
Okay. Well, the only differences that matter, and earlier you made a thing about, you know, you said that I sometimes, you know, don't respond well to certain things being repeated or copied or just some way kind of reappropriated. My only discomfort is when things are used inappropriately. So in everything that I've appropriated, I felt at the time that some rationale, some reason, and also some respect. You know, I put what we could have almost called a remix of a futurist poster by Fortunato De Pero. I put that on New Order's first album, Movement. But in doing so, I had to say to myself, how would the futurists feel about this? How would Marinetti feel about New Order? And I kind of thought, in 1981, Marinetti would really like New Order. This experiment of driving forward with technology in music, a kind of relentless, you know, kind of thrust into the future would be, I mean, New Order would definitely have been one of the futurists, you know, kind of favored groups at that time. So I didn't feel it was inappropriate. And because of the kind of cultural integrity that New Order had, that Factory had, I did not at that time see an issue with appropriating the futurist cover. I could discuss it and debate it quite differently now, but at the time I didn't have a conscience about that. And in most cases where I have picked something up from one place and put it down in another, I've tried to do that respectfully and with some knowledge.
Yeah.
Now, I get a bit frustrated, as we all do, when very young people just move everything around without knowing where anything fits. Now, sometimes we can forgive them for that. Other times we can think, actually, that's really fucking lazy. You know, you should just, you know, think a little bit before you pick something up in one place and put it down in another.
But isn't there something kind of wonderful about that naivety?
There is, but yes, but again, the naivety is wonderful, but not if it's merely an excuse for laziness, for indifference.
But then maybe it's not laziness. Maybe it's kind of that, just that natural ignorance, which kind of
yes,
just
but
age.
at what point do we stop forgiving natural ignorance? At
But then
5
it seems
or
like
50? You know,
it's easier to make good work when you're ignorant.
It's easier to make good work when you don't know what you're doing, but of course there are some, without a doubt, you do. I mean, things that I did when I was in my 20s, I wouldn't do now, and I know that I'm too straitjacketed by concern to have that freedom now.
So did you find it easier to make good work when you were...
Well, it's a matter of what you call good work. It's easier to make free work when you... The less you know, the less you're impeded. Now, what's good and what's influential are different things. You know, I probably would make better work now, but it might be less influential because of the context. So that freedom can constitute to something being very influential. It's not necessarily good, but
So
it might be important. Things can be important and not good. You know, God Save the Queen. Is it good or is it important? It's definitely important and it's definitely influential. Is it good? Debatable.
Which of your work is good and which of your work is important?
Probably the later, more finessed work I would call good, and some of the earlier kind of more transgressive work is maybe a bit more important. But also it's a matter of how you judge important. I mean, you know, my work in Manchester for 10 years has been very marginal. You know, if you do something in the political sector, you do not get your own way. You sit at a table with 20 other people and you contribute a micro kind of moment. You contribute a little tiny bit of catalyst to something. But then if that brings about major change, then, you know, how do you weigh important? So you know, what we see as important is kind of on a sliding scale. But so kind of irresponsible appropriation can be irritating to all of us. Okay, it can occasionally be genius and brilliant, and other times it can just be kind of dumb. I mean, we see people walking down the street and we'll go, wow, whose idea was that, in a good way, and wow, whose idea was that in a really bad way. So, I mean, I think we have mixed opinions about naivety. The thing that most upsets me is when my work, or in some model of my work, the cultural canon is appropriated for unsuitable intent, or to an unsuitable intent.
What's unsuitable
well, you know,
to you?
So to kind of sell text packages, to use the codes of culture to legitimize banality. So the blatant pursuit of profit, the unnecessary, the untruthful, the disrespectful, the disturbing. I mean, we see constantly now in commercial communications.
But then it seems to me from what you're saying, and just from things that
Yeah.
you've said before, you don't think it is possible to reconcile creativity with commerciality.
No, I know it is. No, it is. It may not, there's different ways of looking at it. It may not be what you feel like doing with your life, or your day, week, month, year, or, you know, time in your life. It might not be what you want to do. It might not seem urgent to you. But of course you can do it, but you need to be on a shared wavelength.
How often are you on that wavelength, though? You once said very famous.
Less often, I have to say. I mean, you know, here we are at SHOWstudio, which is, you know, came out of conversations that Nick and I had some time ago. We think 15 years ago. Okay. Nick and I have worked really successfully together on certain projects over the 30 years that I've known Nick. And I'm sure that he would agree that there were moments, the most successful moments, the most pleasing moments, the most worthwhile moments in all senses, were those ones where we felt on some equivalent wavelength with our partners in the project, the people who had initiated it, were working on it with us, that the purpose for which the work was put, you know, and there were moments working for Yoji in the 80s. There were certain record covers that Nick and I did together in the 90s. There were these moments where this all seemed like a good idea, and that where the work wanted to take us was there was the liberty for it to do that. Now, the interesting and positive thing with creative work is actually when it takes you somewhere. So you have an idea, you have a starting point, you have some kind of intent in mind, but then the work finds itself. So what you thought you were going to do is often not what you do, but it gets you there and it starts something, and then you find what is really there. We are increasingly in a culture where commissioned work, commercially commissioned work, has to be approved before the work is started. Now, this used to happen in rather dumb areas of advertising. So chocolate bars, you know, cleaning products, television sets, where there was a very formal, motor cars, a very formal relationship between consumerism and advertising, and, you know, this is how we're going to do your ad. But even then, those ads were visualized with marker pens. So they weren't exactly the picture that was going to be taken. So you could have given even Irving Penn a magic marker rough, and he could still produce a great picture. We have a situation now where digital media allows for a predetermined image and campaign to be produced before any work has started. Okay, so things are scanned, copied and manipulated, and then signed off by the necessary people who have to sign off on them. Then that work is given to so-called creatives and artists as virtually paint by numbers to deliver. And sometimes you can't even deliver it because of the way that it's been created. You can't deliver it. Or we want it like this, but we can have it happier. We want it like this, but it can be more colourful. Well, it's black and white. How do we do that? Well, you're creative. I mean, it's just kind of it's restrictive. It's entirely non-artistic. Nick and I have found ourselves in recent years with one or two commission situations, which could have been great, that could have been finding something. And, you know, we've been entirely straitjacketed by a predetermined idea of what the end result is going to be. Now, everybody that I speak to in the creative communications world says to me that it's just getting more and more and more like that, which makes me very relieved that for the last 10 or 15 years, I have been outside of that world, not running a studio, not employing people, not having an agency of some sort, and therefore not kind of harnessed by this kind of so-called creative work.
But is it hard doing that? Because in a way you forfeit a lot of things. You
Yes.
forfeit
I forfeit
recognition
lots of
and
things.
money.
Yeah,
And
exactly. I thought, you know, I don't actually, I mean, I live in my studio and I don't own it. And not owning where you live in London these days is not comfortable. So, you know, I will be 60 this year, and in that sense, I'm like 60 going on 16. I have great sympathy with everybody under 40 in London who doesn't own a place either. It's a real horror show. I mean, it's really, really terrifying, truly terrifying. And I get great sympathy for that, because I am also in my version of that uncertainty and fear.
so do you feel in a weird way, I think you can acknowledge, you know, even with kind of natural modesty, that people see you as highly influential, but do you think that the influence of your work hasn't been properly kind of recognised, whether that's financially or whatever?
There is enormous recognition from in some quarters.
Yeah.
Okay, so it would be, you know, kind of blind of me. It would be ungrateful of me to not acknowledge that. And some of that recognition is quite formal and institutional. And some of it is entirely casual. So, you know, I can still walk down the street and somebody will, you know, say something nice, which is great. They're kind of impromptu moments, which can often get you through the rest of the day or even the whole week. So there is that recognition. Exactly what label to apply, exactly where we started this, is kind of difficult. That's often a bit of a challenge. And in truth, really, the only form of further recognition that I would quite like would kind of be somewhere to live. Actually, yes, would be a Peter Saville institution where I could sort of live until I die. That would be like just somewhere that I could call, if there was like a Peter Saville museum that I could call home whilst I was still alive, that would be kind of convenient. That would take an awful lot of anxiety and stress off me at this late stage in my life. That would be really nice. I would like to sleep in my own museum. It can become a mausoleum, museum, then mausoleum. That would be brilliant. The bigger recognition or deeper recognition, that tends to come in retrospect, and because of the kind of the diversity of the work, you know, I mean, how can anybody other than myself know where things have gone? And I forget and also don't realize. I'm still surprised by people who come to me and said, "Oh, by the way, I did this because of that." I went, "Wow, really? I would never have imagined that." So there's probably a bigger landscape, a kind of a picture of things that the opportunity that I had influenced. There's probably a reasonably, you know, an unknown, and it still happens, you know, even Unknown Pleasures, you know, the first album cover, still comes back in unexpected ways from, you know, almost every week. So the first work that I put together in 1979, that still comes round like a comet or orbiting almost every week. Unknown Pleasures comes back in another form or another. The Flowers, the Fantin Latour, that one's been coming back again and again and again in recent years. I mean, obviously predominantly in fashion. The influence of the Fantin Latour, you know, Basket of Roses, you know, has been reverberating around quite powerfully the last few years.
Why?
Because actually, well, this is quite because actually, we like those things. The funny thing about me putting chintz on a New Order cover was that it kind of legitimized it. It was okay. It made it cool. It made it cool to say, I like that flower painting. It made flower painting groovy. That's what it did. There's certain contexts where we can place things. I mean, this is like totally, you know, fashion practice. You can pick something up from one place, and it's kind of, it's curation, and it's the credibility, the legitimacy that certain curation or curatorial context endows upon something. So if you put a romantic 19th century oil painting of roses on a progressive album cover, you know, on a New Order cover, it makes it groovy. You put a road sign on the cover of Kraftwerk's Autobahn, and it makes road signs cool.
But you've kind of then legitimized the very practice then, haven't you? Because you're putting something on something to legitimize it. So in a sense, that's kind of opening the door for fashion people to whack your stuff on a t-shirt or on the back of a jacket.
Which they do.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing I get the most pleasure from, and particularly, I mean, the last few years it's been everywhere again with flower prints. I mean, I know that Power Corruption Lies is patient zero of that, and I know it is, because it went out and touched certain people who thought it was cool, who then integrated it into their work, and then it self repeats. So there will be people, you know, who obviously don't know what the provenance back is.
But they do it anyway.
Because they kind of entered at some point later in the stage. But I know I know what the provenance is. I know what the provenance is of most things that I see. It's what I do. You know, I still look in the channels of dissemination of media, and I recognize where most things come from. I get interested and piqued when I don't recognize where something comes from, where I see something and think, wow, like, where's that coming from? Or how did that get put together?
How often does that happen?
Not very often, but you know, it's good that it still. I mean, I remember I saw that there's I call them a graphic studio. They're not a studio. There's some Dutch designers called Metahaven. And I don't often see things from the graphic medium which surprise me, but Metahaven's work did. Mainly because of its kind of integrity and the sense of purpose to which they were bringing a kind of a dystopian aesthetic. There was a lot of sense in what they were doing. And it's just more difficult now. Things are sort of burdened. I mean, it upsets me, or I don't know if it upsets me. It concerns me that the air is now the air in which we exist is now a kind of globalized corporate concern. That combination of Google and other service providers and phone companies and Apple and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. That the channels of social connection are corporately owned. That's a strange irony. It's what I call it the air. It's like the medium in which we're freely existing, and the medium in which with which we have this sense of total liberty
isn't free.
Not really, no. It's not really free. Not only is it not free, it's like it is owned by others. So it's free for you to use as you want to, kind of, we think. But it's come to feed like a kind of a corporate monsters that have changed. I mean, Apple is a fascinating example of it. Our perception of Apple has so radically shifted over the last 20 years. From being the kind of company that you wanted to believe in, to becoming the kind of company that you most fear. And that's this, and so unnecessarily. Apple have become a highly exploitative company. And that really upsets me, because particularly as a designer, you know, Apple was the first kind of computer that I had a relationship with, and the first computers in my life were Apple computers, and Apple was one of those kind of icons of independence and of difference and of values and of believing in something and making a product the way we believe in doing it. And so it, of course, when it began to become increasingly successful, you know, there was initially a great feel-good factor there, say, oh great, they were ultimately rewarded for doing something the right way. But then that's given way now to, you know, a fear of the machine and the I think fairly blatant misuse of control. I mean, to see hundreds of people queuing up unnecessarily outside Apple stores around the world for a product they don't need, or for a product with some features that they could have had 6 months ago on the last one they bought, is kind of like wrong. It's the Apple position has become abusive. Obviously, if any organization, company, cause has to make some money in order to keep going, then that's absolutely fine. You supportive of being an investment in this thing that you believe in. But when you get to the point where you've actually got so much money that you can't even admit how much money you've got so much money that you have to keep it, you know, parked offshore in order to not have to pay tax on it. It's wrong. And also, you know, why aren't you employing people in your own nation? You know, why are the products being increasingly made cheaply in other parts of the world when they could actually be employing people in America? You know, and it's not as if there's a profit margin problem there. And the same kind of applies to all of the other kind of behemoth corporations that have grown up. It's kind of like, well, it's become almost, well, how big can we get? You know, how much money can we make? And so a lot of the idealistic, visionary ideas that the internet was the beginning of, or the realization of, they have turned into a kind of a land grab of owning the world that people exist in now. And this kind of slightly ironic there.
You like irony, though.
Well, I do, but not. But I mean, it seems in the kind of post-60s transgressive youth culture that I grew up in. This state of being beholden to the corporate was something that we entirely fought against all of the time. I mean, I can't bear the idea of seeing 200,000 people want to go to the V Festival. I mean, of course, go to a festival that's entirely that's stating some resistance against the herding and controlling of you. Do something countercultural, something that's against the corporate manipulation of you all, but not go sheepishly to just the meaningless support of corporate control. I just find it, from Woodstock to the V Festival. I mean, it's just.
It's interesting that you're talking
what
about
happened?
Identity in the sense of like being an individual, because it's something I wanted to ask, which is this idea of the difference between your work and you, which seems to have kind of had a different relationship at different points of your career. Maybe the early work is very much you, the later work less so.
Yeah.
And it kind of ties into this idea of like the cult of Peter Saville, which was this kind of weird thing that I don't quite understand. Maybe you don't understand either. But
I do.
Explain, okay, do that first. What is the cult of Peter Saville?
It's the thing I mentioned earlier that in many cases, people had a little moment with something early on that they hadn't had before. Something that introduced an idea that family or state or school or life so far had not introduced. That's what it's based on.
Okay.
And oddly, because of the canon of pop, it recurs. So in a way that one would not have imagined or expected. So of course, in my case, the Unknown Pleasures cover is, Unknown Pleasures is required listening for each subsequent generation of young people, in the same way that the Beatles or the Velvet Underground or Kraftwerk, etc., are as well. That there is a canon of pop, and young people are growing up in that canon, and they sort of, the cooler, smarter, more devoted ones, they want to know what came before, what got us to the now. And of course, Joy Division are in that canon. There are certain visual things to do with Joy Division and New Order covers, which are kind of slightly different. So that little kind of moment of
discovery.
Discovering something else that life might not have shown you yet, it still recurs.
But then that's what I'm interested in. I guess that moment. It is that difference between you and your work, because I think people have definite ideas about what your work is about. But is it expressive? Like, who are you, basically?
Who am I? Thank you. The thing that I am, or the being that I am, is one that's probably a little bit overactive in some ways. Some people laugh at that. It's like I used to spend half the day in bed, but I would, be sort of lazily overactive. Overactive in the sense of looking at a lot of different things all of the time. Being diversely interested in things. So from science to fashion to politics, and then as you get older, that range of things that you're interested in still continues. But also, I maintain an interest in some of the earlier ones as well. So I'm interested in a lot of different things and look at a lot of different things.
But that's not you. That's what you're
No,
interested
that's
in.
what I do. But then what I do is I see the connections between things, and I see parallels between things, and that's not my work. That's just me. I like reading. I like reading the visual world. So actually, when I was a kid, I read. These days, I don't read. I haven't read a book for 40 years, really. I mean, I will read fact information, but I haven't read a novel since I did A-level English, which is some time ago. But I read what's in front of me all of the time, and I tend to see slightly abstract connections between things that other people don't see. So for example, when Nick and I were working for Yoji with Mark Askerley, we'd go and we'd see a collection, and they'd see volumes and shapes or whatever, and I'd see Cologne Cathedral, for example. I would see abstract, seemingly abstract connections or references between things. That's what I tend to do, and I am interested and philosophical about how things fit together. When I went to art college, I was not, I went as a graphics student, but I spent no time in the graphics department because that was kind of boring. It was much more interesting to go and hang out with the people, predominantly the girls in fashion, and the people doing photography, and one or two people doing product design. That was much, much more interesting. But what I tend to find in the world is people who tend very much to stay in their own camp, and then particularly once they start working in a sector, they kind of stay in that camp. And this astonishes me. I mean, it astonishes me that fashion people kind of like live in fashion world. And like art people live like in art world, and business people and political people, they all actually seem to exist fairly comprehensively in their own silo, cross over a bit when they read the newspapers or watch TV or go online and check things, but they don't really live in those, they don't exist in those worlds. I'm quite interested to pass through these different worlds. I'm obsessive about pornography. I was thrilled when I did a project with a famous porn photographer. This one of those things, to be able to go and be, to know a little bit about that world, to get invited by Nick to meet Mark Askerley, to do something in fashion in the mid-80s. This was brilliant for somebody who'd been obsessive about fashion for 20 years or however long. Yes, probably 85. Yeah, for 20 years. Since I'd been the age of 10, I was fascinated by image and identity and fashion. So then to get invited into fashion was brilliant. So and to do something in governance, in my 50s, this is great. We all like to sit around saying what should go on in the world. Well, actually nice to go and touch it. A few years ago, I did a football shirt. I did the England football shirt. It was amazing to go to Wembley and see Wayne Rooney and Steven Gerrard and go wearing a shirt that I'd done. That was weird. I like football. I watch football on TV, but to actually have certain kind of iconic players wearing an idea that you'd proposed was a thing. So I am about, who am I? I am about somebody who is interested in the fluidity and the connectivity between things. and a kind of an understanding of the now. So from that cliched term zeitgeist, which was a great discovery for me at the age of 18, to understand what is zeitgeist, what is that, why is that? I mean, that's a socio-cultural, socio-political, socio-economic phenomenon, the zeitgeist. What exactly is it? To understand things. I mean, Einstein went crazy trying to find ultimately the solution to everything, and I'm kind of probably heading that way towards going crazy, seeking the solution to things. I mean, I increasingly try not to find the solution, but to understand the world that I happen to be in, that I'm living through. There's a very interesting, so for example, maybe this might be somewhere to finish, Lou, to get us out of this. There's, and I'm like born in a moment of interesting transition. So I was like born in 55, which is usually kind of quoted as like the first year of pop. It's the kind of beginning. So I'm some kind of pop human. With pop being in social history like a phenomenon, the post-war period, the dissemination of opportunity to many, the notion of popular culture being a thing, the thing. Well, that was an entirely new moment in human history. That something for everybody being the most important thing. Wow, that was a new idea. I'm born in that time and shaped by, in a way, the last phase of analog history. The last phase of the logical progression of things, of understanding the world as a logical sequence of events. So even there may be illogical moments, they still fall in a logical sequence. The Second World War follows on from the First because of the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, basically, awfully illogical happenings, but when we stem back from them, there was a kind of a logic to how they happened. And people of my generation and older are kind of hardwired to forms of logic. We actually look for solutions in things. We look for logic. We look for understandings of the world. During my mid-career, analog began to give way to digital, gradually, initially. Some of the work I've done with people has been about that transition, about the kind of, in a way, the bipolarity of analog and digital. So when Nick and I did the Suede covers in the 90s, they're both analog and digital. And Nick and I have witnessed in many cases the transition. And the digital began to allow for a kind of a multiplicity of things, for things to happen simultaneously, for there to be more parallel strands going on in digital, both digital practice, but then in a way kind of digital experience. The digital over the last sort of 20 years has really fractured and kind of become atomized. So our experience of things and our relationship to things is kind of atomized. the kind of previous, almost pedantic way of things seems really kind of archaic now. That B would have to follow A, and then C and D, that there would be this kind of logical sequence of things. The era that I grew up in of isms, of a romanticism or classicism or vorticism, the kind of isms of culture leading up to my time, and the kind of mini phases of fashion that were kind of self-contained, have given way to a kind of a pluralism. So in art, in fashion, in culture now, it's pluralist. I mean, there isn't a singular prevailing school at any time. I mean, fashion, not at all. I mean, it would be commercial suicide to base a collection on any particular singular frame. So our cultural experience has become entirely pluralist.
Peter, this is the longest answer anyone's ever given to the question, who are you? Which makes me think you don't know.
And the digital has kind of facilitated that. So you have a situation now where everything can exist simultaneously. And there is the ability to kind of reach into that kind of atomized cloud and see what you get.
But are you better suited to that, or are you better suited to before? How does this relate?
I am suited to before. The answer to who are you is somebody trying to make sense of things for themselves, and when possible, sharing that with others for either vanity or just usefulness. You know, there's a mix between the two. You know, we try to be good at something because it's nice to be good at something, it's good to be good at something. Also, there's a certain amount of ego and vanity in wanting to be good at something. But that narrative then about the atomized cloud is who I am, is somebody trying to make sense of something. Now, it may not be make sensible of, but seeing that you can't make sense of it is in itself making sense of something. I try to understand the now, my now. And of course that changes through your life. So, you know, you're 15 years of age in this place and you try to understand that, and then you're like 50 in another place and you try to understand that. And I try to understand the now. It infuriates me. I mean, it makes me really angry, the things that I see going on, the socio-political, the socio-economic things that I see going on, that as you get older, it gets really, really, really very upsetting, understanding, beginning to see what goes on in this world that you live in is really brutal and cruel.
So how do you keep going then? How do you keep going then?
Well, you keep going because you don't have any choice until you die. That's unfortunately the problem. You have to keep going. Now, you can't even stand still in London at this time without paying for it. Okay, so you have to keep going until you die. Dying is the only moment that you can afford to not keep going. It's like sharks, you know, apparently they have to keep moving. We have to keep moving. If we stop moving, if we stop moving, we don't have the comfort of death. We just have the problems of homelessness, bankruptcy, insolvency, being like on the street. I've brushed with homelessness. I brushed with it 20 years ago in America. And actually I brushed with it for several years in a way, in a kind of glamorized version of homelessness, all the way through the 90s. All the way through the 90s. And I don't like it. And it scares me to death. And it would scare me even more now than it did 15 years ago. Even more. It's ruthless out there. And more so. Much more so in the UK of the now than the UK in which I was a teenager. And yes, I had a privileged upbringing in a wealthy middle class family, and yes, I was looked after, but it was different times. The universal fear which hangs over everybody, over young people, was not so prominent then. I mean, you know, when I see what's happening in the UK, you know, the strange imbalance of London, well, more than imbalance, you know, each month when I go to Manchester still, and I look at the rest of the UK, you know, I see things to be deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about. I mean, we're living through those interesting times that we're living through are also not just analog to digital, but also a tectonic shift in the wealth hegemony of the world. The last 500 years hegemony of the West is giving way through market forces to the East. So we are living through the decline of the privileged West. That's all that's happening.
Are you scared about the future?
Well, I would be really scared if I had children. If I had children, I would be really concerned for them, really concerned. But I don't have any children. So I'm scared about my own future, but I'm not scared about the future beyond me. I think humans will do what humans do. I mean, maybe their brilliant technologies that they've invented will take over from them. There are certain quite intelligent people who think that will happen. I am terrified of the next 5 or 10 years, of my own 5 or 10 years, and deeply unsettled by it. You know, I have an income at this time whilst I keep working, but only enough of an income to slightly keep my head above water in London. As yet, I have nothing to fall back on. And, you know, I'm getting older and more tired and less inclined to do ridiculous, banal work for people that comes up, the kind of things that you get paid for. And, you know, in that sense, I'm, you know, like I said earlier, 60 going on 16. And I don't really want to be 16 at 60. I'm not fit enough. I don't like the way the world has gone, particularly over the last 20 years, particularly since, you know, I found out what a recession was first time round in 1990. That was enlightening and educational to me. I still cannot fathom what happened since the last recession, what happened between 95 and now 2015, what was allowed to happen in our society astonishes me. It's morally bankrupt what has been allowed to happen. The dereliction of duty by governance over that period is almost total. The society of Great Britain is pretty much like thrown to the wolves, as it is being in other countries.
How do you stay creative if you don't feel optimistic?
To pay the rent.
It's a good note to end on. Thanks, Peter.
Okay.